found myself investigating these murder cases, and I found myself with a gift I didn't know I had, and that was the gift of interrogation. I could tell when someone was lying. I could tell what they needed to be asked. And pretty soon the cops were relying on me completely. And I was running all these homicide investigations. And ultimately, I was named the Chief Deputy Attorney General for the office, number 2 law enforcement officer in the state. And, we had an awful lot of crime. It was the early 70s, and, the kind of the country overnight in the 60s went from a place where people didn't lock their doors at night to a place where people were trying the latest security device on their homes.
Right.
And so that's what I did. And when I left the office to go into private practice as an attorney, I decided to write a novel, based on the cases that I solved with primarily through interrogation. And the book was called The Right to Remain Silent. It was picked up by, this is 1988, it was picked up by TriStar Pictures, but the movie was never made. I own the rights if there's anybody out there that wants to make a movie of my first book. So I continued to work as a lawyer, and one day I was doing mostly medical malpractice work. I stopped doing criminal law, either as a prosecutor or a defense attorney. And I got a call from a guy named Franny McDonald, who was an associate in the Philadelphia mob. Delaware, my office in Wilmington, Delaware. Delaware is kind of a continuation of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is our airport, our theaters, that sort of thing. And so I got a call from the Philly mob, a gentleman by the name of Frank the Irishman Sheeran, a well-known hitman, the Wilmington, Delaware Teamsters president, and the number 1 suspect in the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance. He's been written about in 6 books on the Hoffa disappearance and in several articles. He was profiled in the New York Times, profiled in Newsweek. And eventually, back around 1980, the FBI got Sheeran, convicted him. The FBI knew who done the Hoffa thing. They knew who done it, but they couldn't prove anything. They just knew who done it from informants, but the informant's information was limited. And so they went after Sheeran the way they went after Al Capone for tax evasion. They got him for, they would have gotten him for anything they could get him for, but they got him for labor racketeering and related offenses that really had more to do with labor laws than with criminal laws. And although those labor laws were criminal laws, and he ended up getting a 32-year jail sentence. And I get this call from Franny McDonald from the Philly family. They wanted to get him released early on medical grounds, and I was doing medical legal work at the time. So I represented him, and he did have severe medical problems, and it was pretty easy to get him out. And once I got him out, he took us to dinner, my staff, really to lunch, I should say, late lunch. And so I sat at a table with my own staff and with Frank Sheeran, the Irishman, and 8 guys named Rocco. I can say that because I'm Italian. And
I'm sorry.
After the lunch, Frank Sheeran, the Irishman, took me aside. He was 6'4", 220 pounds, a World War II veteran. He had 411 combat days when the average was 80, and when if you had 200, you were eligible for immediate discharge. But he was in the war from the beginning to the end. Even after the war was over, because he was so big and so tough, the army sent him to Austria because the Russian soldiers were raping Austrian women, and the army was sent there to stop that, which they did. The war ended in May, and he didn't get out until October. In any event, he took me aside, and he said to me, I've been written about in every book on Hoffa's disappearance. There were 6 of them at that point. I've been written about in every article on Hoffa. and everybody says I had something to do with it. Well, I didn't have anything to do with it, and I want a book on the other side of this, that I didn't have anything to do with it, and I want you to write it. He said, I read your book, The Right to Remain Silent, based on my interrogations, and a book all about interrogation. I read your book, and I want you to write my book for me. Well, the first thought I had was, you want me to interrogate you? No. I teach interrogation to cops. I teach interrogation to lawyers, and you know that, Frank. You also know that the then President Reagan sent me, when the book came out, The Right to Remain Silent, he sent me an unsolicited letter on commending me on behalf of law-abiding Americans. And you want me to write your book? No. You got something on your mind, Frank, that you want to get off. That's how I sized it up. And I met with him at his apartment in Springfield, Pennsylvania. It was a 5-hour meeting. And during that time, he gave me 80% of what happened to Hoffa, plus some other stuff that's talked about in the book.
Charlie, if I can just interrupt you here. You said this is important to me. Where did you meet him? In Springfield, Pennsylvania?
Yeah, at his apartment.
Okay. And you're not talking about western Pennsylvania, are you? The western part of Pennsylvania?
No, this is Springfield, just outside of Philly.
Okay. I want to make that distinction because Springfield from here, from where we sit, is about 15 miles.
We got a Springfield right by us.
I want to make that distinction. We have a lot of local listeners.
You got a Springfield out in the Pittsburgh area?
Yes. It's north of it, yeah. But thank you for that distinction.
That's a part of the country that Perry Como was from. These people in Springfield, Pennsylvania, and in the Philadelphia area were different kind of Italians. They weren't Perry Como Italian.
Okay.
And Frank was he sat at the right hand of Russell Buffalino, the most powerful boss in America, and he also sat at the right hand of Jimmy Hoffa. And so we spent 5 hours talking at the apartment. You know who else is from that Springfield area is Al. What's his name? Al Martino. He played Johnny Fontaine, the singer, in the 3 Godfather movies, and he was from that Springfield. Anyway, I digress. So I spent 5 hours with him. He confessed to participating in Hoffa's disappearance. He didn't tell me yet that he had pulled the trigger, but I knew he had from the way he answered questions. And as I mentioned, I was an interrogator. I knew what to ask. I knew how to ask it. I knew where to sit. I knew where he should sit. And it just flowed. Everything he told me up to a point, I typed up, and I brought it back to him. And he read it and turned to stone and said, you can't use that. Russell Buffalino is still alive. There are a lot of people still alive. And it was almost as if he had been in an alcoholic blackout, and he did drink a lot and didn't really realize what he was saying. And there's an old Latin expression about in wine there is truth. And he was a red wine drinker. And so that helped me. But he had no interest in meeting with me anymore, and no interest in me writing the book, clearing him. And I said to him, if you change your mind, or if these people start to go to jail or die that you're concerned about, and he named all the names. In fact, a tribute to the FBI, they had all those names in their famous Hoffa report that outlined who were the suspects. And Frank was high on that list. And so I went about my business, and he went about his. And then about 8.5 years later, his daughters, who were very strict Catholics, and Frank had been raised a strict Catholic. His father had studied for the priesthood for 5 years. His mother went to Mass every morning And Frank drew on that religious background to help him during the war. He prayed a lot during the war. And so his daughter wanted him to have absolution before he died. And so she took him to a church in that area called St. Heldespor's Church. St. Dorothy's Church, Monsignor Heldesor. And he got absolution, and then he contacted me and wanted to continue to talk to me.
Wow.
And he had this, you don't see it that often, but it exists, that desire to confess. And that was the premise of my first book, The Right to Remain Silent, that some people have this desire to confess. Where you would have seen it is in the O.J. Simpson case, which is getting a bit of a revival on TV.
Yeah, we were just talking about
and we were going to ask you about that because
they played that interview from 2006 where he talks about what he would have done hypothetically, and then starts talking in the first person.
And in fact, my wife and I both, your name rolled off of our lips. But please, continue.
Now, I watched it, by the way. Anything that has to do with interrogation, I'm still hooked. But anyway, he kept slipping into the first person. It essentially was a confession. I mean, it was.
Yeah.
It might have to be edited until you get the basics of a confession. But what I was going to say is that when he finished that Ford Bronco ride, that kind of aimless ride of his, and returned to his house at Rockingham,
right,
where the police were waiting for him, they were not permitted to ask him a single question under the laws of the U.S. Supreme Court that were instituted in 1966 with the Miranda decision. And it's not just the Miranda decision. There's dozens of decisions that were based on it and followed that same theme of suppressing confessions and suppressing evidence. And so they were not permitted to say, "Hey, O.J., how was the ride?" They weren't allowed to ask him a single question. But if they had been allowed to ask him a question, he would have folded like there's no tomorrow. He was just out there on this crazy drive. The evidence was overwhelmingly against him. And when I give a talk, I say my Italian grandmother, who couldn't read or write in Italian, much less English, could have gotten a confession from O.J. in a heartbeat when he stepped out of that Bronco. "O.J., what did that Jezebel do to you? Oh, Mama Rose, what she put me through." Bingo. But they weren't allowed to solve that crime. And so that remained kind of a good example for wife beaters and domestic violence abusers to feel like, it's hard to convict me of beating my wife or whatever it is. It does no good for society to have had that case be a not guilty. It does no good for our status in the world to have had that case result in a not guilty. And there's more I could go on about that.
Well, that was just jury nullification, right? I mean,
sort of.
Okay.
Sort of. But if you get your confession, you don't have to worry about the jury nullifying anything. I have my own theory on what went wrong in that case, and but
okay,
we could digress here.
Well, you know what, we certainly don't want to take you off point. You've got an amazing stories. You just continue on, and this is fascinating. You're a human lie detector, for crying out loud, and of course teaching police agencies, officers, and the techniques of interrogation. It really is both an art and a science. And how you went over the confidence of Frank Sheeran and others. So go ahead and continue.
And I learned myself from some great cops. There was a Wilmington police detective named Charlie Burke. He's the late Charlie Burke. And when I asked him once,